Good afternoon. Welcome to the after lunch panel. This is session 6 of the conference. The title is Dynamic Institution in Law. My name is Ronit Ricci. I'm a member of the Center for the Study of Conversion, and I'm also the faculty at the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University in the Department of Asian Studies and Religion. We have 4 speakers on our panel, so I will be very strict with the time, just so everyone has a chance to speak, and that we also have a little bit of time at least for discussion. Our first speaker is Camilla Adang, who is Professor of Islamic Studies at Tel Aviv University. She studied languages and cultures of the Middle East at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, where she also defended her PhD thesis, which was titled Muslim Writers on Judaism in the Hebrew Bible from Ibn Rabban to Ibn Hazm, and that was published in a revised version in 1996 by Brill. She's published widely in social and intellectual, especially polemical encounters between Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages and the Ottoman period, as well as on the controversial legal scholar and theologian Ibn Hazm of Cordoba and the Zahiri School of Islamic law. She's involved in several projects dealing with the intellectual history of Al-Andalus and was one of the principal investigators of the research project Biblia Arabica, the Bible in Arabic among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Among her recent publications are the volumes Ibn Hazm of Cordoba, The Life and Works of a Controversial Thinker, published by Leiden in 2013, edited with Maribel Fierro and Sabine Schmidt, and Accusations of Unbelief in Islam, a diachronic perspective on takfir, with the same co-editors, and published in 2015. So Camilla's talk is titled A Jewish Boy in a Muslim Household, a fatwa by al-Nawawi.
First of all, thanks for the organisers for giving me the opportunity to present what is very much work in progress, as I have not so far worked on Nawawi. Those of you who know me will probably be surprised that I'm not going to talk about Ibn Hazm, but this time I'm not. Okay. Abu Zakaria Yahya ibn Sharaf al-Nawawi al-Dimashqi, later on graced with the honorific Muhyiddin, reviver of the religion, was an influential scholar of prophetic tradition and a jurisprudent of the Shafi'i school of law. He was born in 1233 in Nawar, a small town in the Hawran region of Syria, south of Damascus. His father early on recognized his son's intellectual potential and sent him to the capital to study at the madrasa not far from the Umayyad mosque, where he received room and board. Although his father's original plan was for him to study medicine, Yahya was more inclined to the Islamic religious sciences, especially hadith and jurisprudence. Apparently he had been put off by what he read in Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb by the famous philosopher-physician Ibn Sina, better known in the West as Avicenna. He seems to have devoted most of his time to his studies, avoided socializing, and never married. Yahya al-Nawawi only took time off to undertake the pilgrimage to Medina and Mecca in 1253, together with his father, but he was sick most of the time and chose not to linger in the holy cities, as was common among scholars, but to return to Syria. It is around the year 1257, that is, at the age of 24, that Yahya al-Nawawi seriously started writing, and this was after he had spent his days and nights studying. According to his student Ibn al-Attar, al-Nawawi attended 12 classes each day on hadith and the transmitters, law and its sources, grammar, theology, and other topics. His works made an impression, and soon in 1267 he was invited to take up the position vacated by the death of the renowned jurist and hadith scholar Abu Shama, better known nowadays as a historian, at the prestigious Dar al-Hadith al-Ashrafiyya in Damascus. Al-Nawawi acquired a reputation for fairness and asceticism. While declining a salary for himself, he attempted to negotiate better conditions for teachers at the various madrasas in Damascus. Not afraid to speak his mind and following the Quranic injunction to command the good and forbid evil, He clashed with Mamluk Sultan Baybars after refusing to issue legal opinion endorsing the latter's oppressive taxation policies. The Sultan retaliated by expelling an-Nawawi from Damascus, and he returned to his native town of Noah, where he died in 1277, aged 44. Despite the fact that he died at such an early age, an-Nawawi left some 40 works, some of them voluminous, in a number of disciplines such as grammar, Quranic studies, Sufism, and especially hadith and law. Among his most important and best-known works are his commentary on Sahih Muslim, one of the two most authoritative collections of prophetic traditions, a work entitled Minhaj al-Talibin, which would become one of the standard works of Shafi'i jurisprudence, Riyad al-Salihin al-Bustan al-Arifin, which reflect a moderate type of Sufism, and many other less well-known works, among them his collection of fatwas, legal opinions issued at the request of a petitioner, a genre of legal literature similar to the She'elat al-Shuvot in Judaism. And it is to this collection of texts that I should like to draw your attention in the remaining time. It was not an-Nawawi himself who gave the collection its present structure. Rather, he recorded the fatwas in the order in which they were solicited, so that his original notes on the questions and his replies to them were not at all coherent. He hoped at some later point to be able to put the material in a logical order, but his untimely death prevented this. It was his student Ibn al-Attar who took it upon himself to arrange the material in coherent rubrics according to accepted practice in jurisprudential literature. Thus we find sections dealing with ritual purity, different types of prayer, almsgiving, pilgrimage, fasting, commercial law, property law, personal status law, that is, marriage, divorce, and inheritance, oaths and vows, judicial practice, penal law, etc., in addition to some sections dealing with non-legal subjects, such as Quranic readings and sound or unsound hadith. These sections were placed at the very end of the collection by Ibn al-Attar, who also inserted throughout the work some fatwas that he himself had heard from an-Nawawi. All in all, the collection contains over 350 fatwas, not including the lengthy section on Quranic exegesis. For reasons that are not immediately clear, Ibn al-Attar decided to place the fatwa to be discussed here under the rubric divorce. An-Nawawi made a point of using language easily understandable to non-scholars, or at least to those with no legal training, in order that they might derive benefit from his pronouncements. In most cases, he presented the accepted practice in the Shafi'i school of law, or what he considers the soundest opinion, without discussing differences of opinion within the school or between the different schools of law, although occasionally he will mention a Maliki or Hanafi position. Most of the queries addressed to an-Nawawi are about a point of law, though scattered throughout the different sections we also find some queries about theological issues. In the majority of cases, an-Nawawi provides terse answers to short questions, many of which appear to be theoretical. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the fatwa literature, I'll just say that there are two types of fatwas. Fatwas that reflect practical matters, practical concerns, and that are solicited either by judges or by members of the general public, and fatwas that address purely theoretical and informative questions. The first type is often preceded by a detailed discussion of the issue or problem that gave rise to the query in the first place, sometimes including dates, names, and locations, and as such they constitute an important source for writing the social, economic, and religious history of Islamic societies. The second type, the shorter type, is usually much less informative. Now, to give you an impression what you can find in an-Nawawi's collection, I'll just give you some short examples before we move on to the longish fatwa that concerns us here. So it's question and answer. Is it allowed to eat raw meat? Yes, God knows best. Yeah, and the God knows best is actually a very common expression which, by which the Mufti, the one who issues the fatwa, concludes his pronouncement. Question. These hadiths that report about the merits of eating watermelon, greens, lentils and rice, are they sound? Nothing about them is sound. Question. Is there a hadith that confirms the excellence of Ashkelon, Acre, Ain al-Baqar, Ain Silwan and Ain Qaruz, or not? None of it is sound. Question. A man has a wife and a mother. May he give preferential treatment to his wife over his mother with respect to maintenance and other things such as food and clothing, or does he sin in doing so? Answer. He does not sin in doing so on condition that he takes care to provide sufficiently for his mother if she is used to being provided for by him in a suitable manner. However, it is better to please his mother and to give her preferential treatment. If there is no way but to give preferential treatment to the wife, one must keep this hidden from the mother. Now on to the fatwa that forms the actual topic of my talk, which in the printed edition takes up 2 full pages. The query, the istifta, addressed to a Nawawi, which I assume to be of a hypothetical nature, runs as follows. A son is born to a Muslim man, but the mother dies. He therefore places the child in the care of a Jewish wet nurse who has a Jewish son of her own. The Muslim father is absent for a while, but by the time he returns, the Jewish wet nurse has died, and he cannot tell his own son apart from the son of the Jewish woman. The Jewish woman left no one who could identify her son, nor anyone who knew the Jewish boy's father, and no physiognomist is at hand. What now is the status of each of the 2 boys? Seeing that it is not clear which one is the Muslim and which one is Jewish. And Nawawi's reply starts thus. The status of the 2 children remains suspended until the situation becomes clear through evidence or physiognomy, or they grow up and can trace their respective ancestry. But for the moment, they are placed in the care of the Muslim. If they grow up and no evidence has been found, nor a physiognomist, and they have not been able to trace their ancestry, their suspended status continues with regard to their origin. The Muslim will gently try to persuade both of them to embrace Islam together, but if they consistently decline to accept Islam, they will not be forced to do so, nor will either of them be required to perform the salat prayer, to fast, or to fulfill similar Islamic precepts, because the basic norm is the absence of coercion to be applied to them. And Nawawi adds, we have been debating whether the law should be brought to bear on one or both of them, but then he rejects that possibility, underscoring his point with 2 quite amusing and almost certainly fictitious analogies, which I shall now paraphrase. 2 men are at prayer when the sound of breaking wind is heard. Neither man is aware of having farted, or perhaps neither man is prepared to admit that it was him. Because of this, neither of them can be required to repeat his ritual ablution, and the validity of the prayer of each of them is accepted, although in actual fact, of course, that of one of them has been invalidated by his breaking wind. What Nawawi is saying here is that if one arbitrarily imposes a renewed ablution on one of them, there is a 50% chance that this was not the actual offender. If it is imposed on both of them, then one man is inevitably unjustly affected. Second analogy runs thus. 2 men are looking at a bird and argue about what kind it is. One is prepared to divorce his wife if it turns out to be a crow, whereas the other swears that he will divorce his wife if it is found not to be a crow. Then the bird takes off, but neither can identify it. Yet one of them must be right. It was either a crow or it was not. According to a Nawawi, neither will now be required to divorce his wife, and each of them may continue to enjoy relations with his spouse. For if one should arbitrarily force one of them to leave his wife, when it is not clear who was right about the bird, there is again a 50% chance of error. And if divorce is imposed on both of them, one man is inevitably unjustly affected. In each of these cases, there is an element of doubt or uncertainty, shubha in Arabic, which precludes a clear decision. It is the same with the two children. One cannot arbitrarily decide without evidence who should be required to fulfill the precepts of Islam, for there is a 50% chance that the Jewish boy will thus be forced to perform the precepts of the religion that is not his. And, as An-Nawawi has already stated, religious coercion cannot be applied. An-Nawawi now turns to the legal consequences of the ambiguous state of the two boys, starting with the question who is responsible for their financial support. And he says, as to their maintenance and provisions, if each of them has capital, this will go towards that goal, but if not, then the father of the Muslim child, of course can't tell who is his son, is obliged to pay for the support of his son by virtue of their family relationship, whereas support for the other, i.e. the Jewish boy, falls to the treasury by virtue of his being a dhimmi, on condition that there is no parent who is obliged to provide for the close relative. The assumption apparently being that the Jewish boy is an orphan. Yeah, and destitute dhimmis, Jews and Christians, might be provided for from the Bait al-Mal, the treasury. The next issue addressed by An-Nawawi is that of inheritance. If a close relative of the unbeliever, the Jewish boy, dies, of those from whom the child is due to inherit, his share in the inheritance is suspended until the situation becomes clear. That is, until it becomes clear which of the two children is Jewish. Similarly, if one of the relatives of the Muslim dies before both of them reach maturity. If both children die, or one of them, his possessions remain suspended until evidence is produced or an agreement is produced, unless he has a specific heir, or perhaps he has already contracted a valid marriage, and in that case the wife would of course inherit. Now, what to do if one of the boys dies and it has not been possible to decide who is Muslim and who is Jewish? Where should he be buried? And Nawawi answers as follows. If one of them should die before having reached maturity, his body will be washed and prayed over, and he will be buried between the Muslim cemetery and the Jewish one. So neither here or there, but in between. However, if he died after having reached maturity and having declined to embrace Islam, his body may be washed, but no prayer may be said over him, as he is either a Jew or an apostate. And it is not allowed to marry either of them after they've reached maturity and declined to embrace Islam, because each one of them could either be a Jew or an apostate, and it is not allowed to marry such a person. Yeah, so there's two. First, he talks about burial, then he turns to marriage. In either case, he says that it is that there is a problem because the child could be either an apostate or a Jewish. Now, so if it is not allowed to marry either of the boys because he's either a Jew or an apostate, and as long as the situation is not clear, he says it's like an hermaphrodite whose state is doubtful, and God knows best. Yeah, again, this is the end of the fatwa, God knows best. Now, summing up, the fatwa presented here deals with the rights rather than the duties of two boys whose religious identity cannot be established because of the unusual circumstances in which they grew up. One of them is the son of a Muslim, and as such would be expected to be raised according to the precepts and practices of the Islamic faith, whereas the other has a Jewish mother. The religious identity of the absent father is not mentioned. And had she lived, she would probably have raised the boy in the Jewish faith. Since it cannot be established who is the Muslim boy and who the Jewish one, and Nawawi rules that their status will remain undecided until they grow up and, having reached the age of discernment, will choose whether to embrace Islam or not. Before that time, neither of them will be forced to live by the rules of Islam and fulfill its basic precepts. Since by forcing them, or at least since by forcing them, at least one, the Jewish boy, will lose his basic rights, you could say, though it cannot, of course, be decided who of the two is this Jewish boy. Once they do reach the age of discernment and do not embrace Islam, one of them remains a Jew, whereas the other, the child of a Muslim, and thus technically Muslim, becomes an apostate. Except it cannot be known, of course, nor do they themselves know, apparently, who is who. Now, this query was in all likelihood theoretical, and Nawawi's reply also looks like an exercise in legal reasoning, for it is hard to see how his solutions could be applied in practice. In any case, he is to be commended for upholding the principle that conversion can never be made under duress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Our second speaker is Dr. Inbar Graiver, who's a historian of late antiquity, specializing in early Christianity. She's currently doing her postdoc research on late antique psychology at Humboldt University in the Faculty of Theology. And a book that is based on her dissertation is forthcoming in July 2018 with the publishing house of Toronto University, the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies. And Inbar will speak to us on conversion and self-transformation in early Christian monasticism and interdisciplinary perspective. Please.
So thank you. And this paper is, I think, responsible for the dynamics part of the title of this session, so it will be a bit different from the other ones. And let me explain what I mean. So conversion is predicated on the capacity of humans to change the way in which they perceive and experience the world. And this paper is devoted to this transformative process, which I propose to examine from a joint historical and cognitive viewpoint. More specifically, I'll try to reconstruct from late antique sources some aspects of the transformation implicated in religious conversion by drawing on cognitive research on attention and its role in promoting both cognitive change and changes in the brain, what is known as brain neuroplasticity. Collaborative research in this field is, to my mind, one of the most exciting domains of interdisciplinary research in this century, and I will try to demonstrate how conversion scholars can benefit from these developments. To do so, I will focus on the unique form that conversion took within the Christian monastic movement in late antiquity, from its emergence in the early 4th century in the Near East to its heyday again in the Near East in the 6th century. Here it is. First, however, talking about conversion in the context of Christian monasticism requires some clarification, since monastic conversion did not involve moving from one religious tradition to another, but from a lower to a higher level of commitment within Christianity. Earlier generation of conversion scholars, following the lead of William James and Eddie Knock, have tended to focus on conversion as a dramatic experience, which entails a radical break with past religious beliefs. A key element of recent critiques of this binary approach to conversion has been to emphasize the role of process over decisive moment. In addition, rather than seeing converts as passive subject of a process not entirely under their control, more recent work has focused on the active agency of converts in the conversion process. This process, moreover, can take many forms. It can entail exchanging the religious beliefs and practices in which one was raised for those of another religious tradition, but it can also entail intensification of belief and practice of one's own religion. So the latter type of conversion played an important role in the early history of the Christian monastic movement, which emerged in different locations in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 4th century. Before the Christianization of the empire, conversion meant simply becoming Christian, and the conversion process was essentially a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. Beginning from the 4th century, however, the monastic movement offered a new path to conversion. For those who were already baptized, it offered a new way for turning from a lax to a fervent religiosity. Now, the monastic path to conversion required a deliberate choice on the part of the convert to make a complete break from his or her former way of life. The primary outward sign of that choice was withdrawal from society and from the inhabited world into uninhabited regions throughout the Middle East. No. The drastic gesture of separation from society, however, was only the first step in a prolonged and demanding process of purification and inner transformation through ascetic training. Actually, ascetic training is a tautology, since asceticism is simply training in Greek, but I use that expression. So years of ascetic training eventually resulted in a gradual yet radical turning around of the soul, reversing its entire orientation. This gradual process of transformation through ascetic training is at the center of this paper, which focuses on early Egyptian and Palestinian monasticism. In particular, I'm interested in the training methods that enabled monastic converts to cultivate new ways of thinking and behaving. And I will examine these methods, as I said, from a cognitive, in view of contemporary cognitive research. Now, conversion scholars have adopted a wide variety of methodologies in order to make sense of this multifaceted phenomenon, yet many still shy away from using cognitive research in historical analysis. This reluctance is to some extent understandable. Cognitive science adopts a reductionist approach, at least traditionally, which assumes that human behavior can be reduced to cognitive processes and their brain correlates. On the other hand, recent developments in historical research emphasize the role of culture and society in determining individual feelings and identities. In this view, there is a fundamental difference. In this view, there is a fundamental difference between ancient and modern minds, and hence the operation of universal cognitive mechanisms is of little importance for understanding ancient minds. It is not my aim, however, to understand ancient minds, nor the subjective experiences of latently converts, it is not my aim to reconstruct the subjective experiences of latently converts, but rather to reconstruct the cognitive strategies, the non-subjective cognitive strategies that enable them to transform themselves, that facilitated and sustained the conversion process. Moreover, it seems to me that the danger of anachronism should not lead us to overlook the basic interdependence of cognition and culture. While many cognitive processes are indeed highly susceptible to cultural variation, the methodological assumption I adopt here is that the minds of modern and historical people are sufficiently similar in general cognitive function to warrant a meaningful comparison in some cases. And I hope to show you that the transformation implicated in conversion is among these cases. Now, admittedly, the focus on cognitive facets of conversion cannot do full justice to its psychological complexity and theological depth, nor can I touch upon its social and institutional aspects. So the explanatory factors that I propose are meant just to supplement the various perspectives from which conversion has been approached. So I will begin this presentation by presenting the training methods that monastic converts employed in order to transform themselves, focusing especially on the cognitive strategies that enable them to purify the mind and reorient their attention. Then, to make more accurate hypotheses about these methods and how they actually worked, I will then go on to review relevant research on attention and how it can produce cognitive change as well as changes in the brain. And finally, I will examine how these findings can be brought to bear on the understanding of monastic conversion. So, monastic conversion. And I will do it very briefly, just the strategies that I feel most relevant for my purposes. So the goal of monastic converts was to form a new relationship with God through contemplation. In the Eastern monastic tradition, to which I refer here, contemplation was considered as a natural activity of the human mind, as it was originally created, that is, before the fall. The monastic way of life was intended to reconstitute the mind in this relapsarian contemplative state. The ascetic training that converts underwent was thus intended to purify the mind from worldly occupations and to refocus its attention on the thought of God alone. Recent scholarship on Christian monasticism, following Peter Brown's groundbreaking work, has tended to focus on the role of the body and bodily training in asceticism. However, although asceticism is ultimately expressed in the body, it was, at least in the Eastern monastic tradition, it was the mind, created in the image of God and capable of union with God, that stood at the center of the monastic path to conversion. Especially in the Eastern monastic tradition, it was the mind that has to be transformed and renewed in the image of Christ. Accordingly, the form of ascetic training on which I would like to focus involved a disciplined and systematic attempt to purify the mind and train attention. Now, the spiritual method of attentiveness, in Greek it's prosotheonepsis, stood at the center of this attempt. Although attentiveness was much more than simply an effort to train attention, this spiritual method did involve, at least initially, a disciplined and systematic effort at attention management. Years of systematic training of this method eventually enabled monastic converts to uproot deeply ingrained habits of thinking and attending in order to redirect their attention toward God. The strategies of attentiveness varied according to the practitioner's level of progress. For beginners, the attempt to purify the mind involved a continual effort to guard the thoughts. That's how it's called in monastic texts. That is, to repel from consciousness every earthly thought as soon as it appears in the mind and refocus attention instead on some spiritual thought. So various strategies were prescribed for this purpose, all of which employ some sort of an anchor to control the mind's focus of attention. For example, repeated invocation of the name of Christ, or quiet repetition of some scriptural phrase, and so on. In all these cases, a basic instruction guided this practice. Whenever attention wanders, one should simply bring it back to the scriptural phrase. By actively and repeatedly bringing the wandering attention back to this single anchor, the mind was gradually quieted, and mental processes were brought under greater control. Whereas beginners were advised, as we saw, to repel thoughts from consciousness immediately, the more advanced, who have already acquired some degree of control over their mental processes, were instructed to allow thoughts to linger in the mind, to entertain them, and to observe them from a distance, as if they belonged to someone else. This form of detached self-observation gradually taught them to distance themselves from certain thoughts and feelings rather than being identified with them. And by the way, this is very different from the Western Cartesian concept of I think, therefore I am. In the monastic view, we're different. We're not identical with our thoughts, and these practices were intended to implement this view. So an additional strategy that supported this process of distancing from one's own thoughts involved a verbalization of these thoughts, again as if they belonged to someone else, in front of an experienced monastic elder. With time and systematic practice, these thoughts were gradually stripped of their personal importance and salience, and hence they no longer stimulated the emotions or distracted the mind. In this way, monastic practitioners were able to uproot and reorient deeply ingrained habits of thinking and reacting in the service of contemplation. Repeated practice of these and additional strategies, with the cooperation of divine grace according to monastic sources, eventually enabled monastic converts to cultivate the mental stability and emotional balance necessary for contemplation. This state of mind is described in monastic sources as a state of dispassion, apatheia, that is apathy, but not in the sense of indifference, but in the sense of not being moved by every single thought and emotion that goes through the mind. So this state of apatheia marked a decisive turning point in the spiritual itinerary of monastic converts. It enabled them to devote themselves single-mindedly to the practice of contemplation and thereby to attain a new mode of existence. So now, to make sense of the training methods that monastic converts employed, I will now draw on cognitive research on attention. For Christian converts, the training of attention was a way of restoring their relations with God, rather than a way of developing special cognitive skills. Yet, inasmuch as their attempt to do so relies on regular mental training, cognitive research, I think, can lend us insight into how this process actually works. Attention and cognitive science. Let me begin with the fact that attention, like other cognitive skills, can be trained and improved through repeated and systematic practice. To clarify how attention can be trained, it's helpful to begin with the more general concept of skill acquisition. Human performance in most cognitive tasks can be improved through practice. At first, effort is required and performance is slow and prone to error, but eventually performance becomes effortless, rapid, and accurate. The notion of automaticity helps to explain this process of skill acquisition. This notion suggests that human cognition comprises of two qualitatively different types of information processing, controlled and automatic. More specifically, every act which is initially voluntary and controlled eventually becomes automatic through systematic and extensive practice. In this process, the controlled, intentional process gradually recedes from consciousness and becomes automatic. Once it recedes from consciousness, it is no longer under voluntary control, and hence it's very difficult to change it. Nevertheless, automatic processes can be changed. They're not entirely immune to voluntary control. It is possible to regain control of such processes simply, not so much simply, but by making them conscious again. That is, by directing and redirecting attention towards them. This way they become conscious and hence liable to voluntary control. In other words, practice leads to automaticity and loss of voluntary control, but control can be regained by becoming conscious of the action. Now, in the past 2 decades, neuroscientists have developed brain-based models that describe the neural systems implicated in this process. These models suggest that repeated acts of attentional control not only affect the activity of the mind, but that in so doing they also rewire the circuits of the brain. This finding has caused a real paradigm shift in the field of neuroscience. From the inception of these fields until just about 20 years ago, the prevailing hypothesis was that the adult human brain is essentially immutable, fixed in form and function, and is almost unchanged by life's experiences. Yet thanks to new technologies, more recent research has shown that the adult brain retains the ability to change its structures, its connections, its functions. In a way akin to brain development in childhood, throughout our lifetime, experiences change the connectivity of neurons in the brain and add new neurons in response to the circuits that are most active. Another discovery in the field was that the brain not only changes throughout one's life, but we can consciously and actively participate in that change and influence its direction by choosing the types of activities that we engage in. The process in which repeated experiences remodel specific connections between neurons and add new ones is known as experience-dependent neuroplasticity. Physical changes in the brain, however, are contingent on attention. Changes in the brain are generated only when behaviors are specifically attended to. Passive or unattended activities are of limited value for deriving neuroplasticity. Hence, although experience shapes the brain, it shapes only an attending brain. In other words, it is attention that makes neuroplasticity possible. With extensive practice, the very act of paying attention may produce real and powerful physical changes in the brain. Now, one type of attention training method that stands out as being particularly effective in producing such changes is meditative practice. The term meditation refers to a variety of attentional training methods, among which two are found with some variation in a wide range of religious traditions. One of them is focused attention meditation, which entails voluntary focus of attention on a chosen object. And the other is open monitoring meditation, which involves a non-reactive monitoring of the content of consciousness from moment to moment. And as we've seen, both meditative styles were employed by Lengatic monks, but I'll come back to that later. So the practice of both of these meditative styles is associated with significant changes in brain activity. Since the 1990s, neuroscientists have studied how meditation alters brain activity. Especially neuroscientist Richard Davidson, with the help of the Dalai Lama, recruited Buddhist monks to meditate inside a functional MRI apparatus while he measured their brain activity. His findings clearly indicate that systematic meditative practice changes the activity and structure of the brain in an enduring way. For example, it creates connectivity among separate circuits in the brain, and this integration produces in turn significant behavioral and mental changes, including the promotion of increased well-being and the cultivation of exceptional cognitive skills, skills in fact that scientists once believed impossible in humans. So to conclude this part, the concept of neuroplasticity presents the possibility of changing automatic thought processes, feelings, and behavioral patterns. Moreover, it implies that people can intentionally influence the direction of these changes by training their attention. So how can all this be brought to bear on the understanding of monastic conversion? The monastic path to conversion is based on the assumption that it is possible for human beings to profoundly transform themselves and improve themselves through systematic training. Contemporary neuroscience lends support to this belief. Thereby it enables us to appreciate the optimistic vision of human potential for change and development which underlies the monastic path to conversion. More specifically, the notion that regular mental training can rewire the brain suggests that Lengatic monks could voluntarily transform their minds and brains throughout their lifetime by training and reorienting their attention. Repeated practice of strategies of focused attention, along with techniques of detached observation of the content of consciousness, would eventually enable them to gain control over automatic cognitive processes that usually lie beyond voluntary control, in order to uproot or renounce them. In monastic texts, this process is described as renunciation. This renunciation of deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and behaving resulted in a profound self-transformation. The collection of sayings known as the Paradise of the Fathers describes this process as follows. At the beginning of their monastic life, monks are afflicted for a long time, not only by the stirrings of thoughts themselves, but also by their lingering in the heart. But after a long time, their motion is restrained, and then the monk has rest from strivings, and he is held worthy of this passion, apatheia. And henceforth, his heart rests and is at peace, and the peace and rest of God rule over the soul. So, through systematic mental training, therefore, monastic converts were able to change their entire mental disposition in order to form a new relationship with God. As this quote implies, cognitive change and change in subjectivity are closely intertwined in this transformative process. This profound transformation, of course, cannot be reduced to cognitive and brain mechanisms, and hence cognitive science is of limited value in the attempt to elucidate the essential features of monastic conversion. Nevertheless, it does lend us, I think, an important insight into the practices and behaviors that promote and sustain the change, and hence into the ways in which monastic converts were able to become active agents in their own conversion. As such, contemporary trends in cognitive science combine well with contemporary approaches in conversion research, which treat conversion as a process rather than a one-time event, and stress the active involvement of converts in the conversion process. Recent research on conversion has also moved away from the tendency of William James and other early figures to focus on their subjective experiences implicated in conversion. Not only is a subjectivist orientation insufficient for addressing the diversity of conversion phenomena, but the attempt to reconstruct the subjective facets of conversion in historical retrospect is often problematic. On the other hand, cognitive research allows us to study the inner dynamics of conversion in a different way, by examining the strategies, the non-subjective strategies, both mental and behavioral, that facilitate and sustain the conversion process. In addition, inasmuch as these strategies are socially prescribed rather than being idiosyncratic or individually chosen, so inasmuch as they are socially prescribed, they provide an important source for studying the intersection of the psychological and the social in conversion. This task is, of course, beyond the scope of this paper, but I propose it as a future direction for research, which seeks to connect the inner dynamics of conversion to its social context. So to conclude, I believe that to the extent that conversion is predicated on change, research on the ways in which people can intentionally promote that change offers new and to my mind, exciting opportunities for studying the complex dynamics of the conversion process. Thank you.
The speaker is Franziska Klein, who is a research associate at the Historical Institute of the University of Duisburg-Essen. She has finished her PhD in medieval history, just, I guess, very recently, spring, yeah. 2018, so congratulations. From 2013 to 17, she was a research assistant and PhD student at the Research Training Group Precaution, Prevision, Prediction of the German Research Foundation at the university, same university. And from May till August 2015, she held a scholarship at the German Historical Institute in London. And she'll speak to us on Coping with Conversion, the London House of Converts Revisited.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is it okay? The year 1232 was a turning point in the history of Jewish conversion in medieval England and a milestone in the history of poor relief for converts in Europe in general. In this year, King Henry III of England founded the House of Converts, Domus Conversorum, not far outside the walls of London. It was established in the so-called New Street, which today is Chancery Lane. In this house, converts from Judaism to Christianity were sheltered, provided for, educated, and later even got vocational training. Today, I will have a fresh look at this special institution in 13th century England. But instead of assuming that it was from the very beginning mainly meant to increase the number of converts in medieval England and to support the mission to the Jews, a view which is shared by most scholars, I want to ask what it did to cope with challenges of conversion and what made it so special regarding to the history of poor relief. As far as I can say, the main focus of European medieval poor relief for converts in general was not so much to stimulate conversion, but to prevent converts from backsliding and to stabilize them in their new faith. Therefore, the London House of Converts had some striking similarities with the early modern houses of catechumens, for example, the Pia Casa in Venice. Just to make this very clear, when I talk about converts, I always mean converts from Judaism to Christianity, never the other way around. This would be an entirely different topic, focusing on very different problems. So, what exactly was the House of Converts and what made it so special? As I said, the house was founded in the first half of the 13th century just outside of London on the way to Westminster. It's where the arrow points. The English monk and chronicler Matthew Paris tells us that Henry III erected a chapel with several buildings attached at his own expense. I quote, "To this house converted Jews retired and had a home and a safe refuge for their whole lives, living under an honorable rule with sufficient sustenance without survival work or the profits of usury." So it happened that in a short time a large number were collected there. And now, being baptized and instructed in the Christian law, they live a praiseworthy life under a governor specially appointed. End of quote. As far as I can tell, during the 13th century, the house accommodated about 70 converts at a time. Sometimes there might have been fewer, sometimes certainly more. In 1291-92, not long after the expulsion of the Jews of England, and not in 1280, this unfortunately is a common error, the number of residents raised to almost 100. Among them were men, women and children, single persons and families who were sometimes admitted alone, sometimes in groups of 2 or 3. The residents came from all over England and moved into the central place for convents. The London house was administered by a warden who was supported by at least 2 chaplains and a priest. We do not know if the warden was allowed to admit converts on his own authority. Every evidence of admittance we have is based on royal letters. It seems that the converts had to send a petition to the king or were possibly sent to court as part of larger procedures and were then forwarded to London. This offers just a first impression of how much this house was a royal institution. A second impression is given by the endowment of the London house. As I said, it was founded and endowed nearly entirely by the English crown, first and most important of all by King Henry III of England. He built the chapel and made his exchequer provide several payments for construction work and similar tasks. Moreover, he promised a yearly payment of 700 marks. Although he never actually provided this enormous sum of money, he and his son Edward did donate several rents and other sources of income to the house. In addition, especially in later years, the house received needs-based payments, which is very special in the Middle Ages, from the crown to cover its expenses, especially the convert stipends. Each male convert who was admitted to the house received 10.5 pence a week. Every female convert got 8 pence a week. We do not know what they had to spend their money on and what was provided by the house. If they had to pay for the necessities of life, the stipend would have been enough to survive, but would not have offered any kind of luxury. While the converts depended on their payments, the house itself depended on the English king. Although it received permanent assets and property, it still could barely survive without constant royal assistance. Whenever this was not available, the house fell into crisis. But this is not for today. The kings of the 13th century, however, exerted influence not only in ways of funding, but also by deciding on the rules and by occasionally overseeing the warden's decisions. According to Matthew Paris, the converts lived under an honorable rule, which points to a rather semi-monastic lifestyle. Since we do not have much information on the daily life in the house, we cannot tell how influential religious obligations really were. There was some kind of communal life from which converts could be excluded, and the sources sometimes refer to the converts as brothers. The converts themselves pointed out in the petition that they prayed for the king, so they obviously were included in royal memoria. Considering there were 2 chaplains and a priest, we can assume with some confidence that life in the house was not too different from other lay communities and hospitals or later almshouses, where religious life and liturgical hours structured the day. Although we do not know very much about the structure of the building either, we should at least very cautiously question the quite common assumption that the converts lived in a dormitory like it was usual in multifunctional hospitals. There are certain hints, especially from the later 13th and from the 14th century, that suggest a slightly more private arrangement. This could have meant separate cubicles in a larger room or even individual rooms. We know this was certain for the 13th century, and we don't know this for certain for the 13th century, but for later times it is quite sure, since the converts did even rent out apartments at a later date. Although the Jews were expelled from England in 1290, the house existed until at least 1609. The number of residents dropped remarkably in the 14th century, but it stayed open for a small number of international converts, for example from France, Germany, Poland, Spain, or Portugal. These pieces of information should suffice to give a basic impression of what the House of Converts actually was. But the question remains, what made the house so special, even a milestone? In my point of view, we have to take 3 approaches into consideration to determine the significance of the London house, which I can only describe briefly today. First of all, regarding to the history of welfare for Jewish converts, the Domus Conversorum was, in my best knowledge, the first institution of its kind. Secondly, regarding to the history of poor relief in general, we have to consider in how far it anticipated certain developments of later almshouses, or may well have been one of the first almshouses in England. Thirdly, regarding to the history of conversion from Judaism to Christianity, it provided a surprisingly comprehensive answer to the main challenges of Jewish conversion, at least from a Christian point of view, and this is primarily what I meant when I chose the title Coping with Conversion. Let me go a bit more into detail. As far as we know, there has been no other house of converts as early as 1232. A few years later, in the second half of the 13th century, there might have been houses with some similarities in France. The problem is that we do not have very specific records on them. There seem to have been at least some groups of converts who were supported by the French crown, but there is no evidence that suggests a comparable centralized institution like the one in London. Except for one later hospital in Cologne, which was neither a royal institution nor had it ever the importance of the London House, and a self-administered house in Hungary, the London House of Converts seemed to have stayed unique until the early modern times, when the first houses of catechumens were founded, especially in Italy. I keep calling the institution the House of Converts, which is nothing but a direct translation of the Latin term used in the sources, Domus Conversorum. There are only very few times when it was called otherwise. In these cases, the sources use hospitale or collegium. This word, domus, seems very common, but actually is quite significant. Not many years later, it was well known as the name of a new and very successful kind of stationary welfare, the Domus Dei, or almshouse. We do not exactly know when this kind of institution appeared first, but its first period of prosperity in England began in the 14th century. These new almshouses differed in several aspects from the earlier kinds of hospitals with which the London House is mostly compared. While the big multifunctional hospital mostly provided short-time care for a very diverse clientele, almshouses provided a more private arrangement for a usually, but not necessarily, lower number of residents who were either known to the patron or at least of local origin. Admittance to an almshouse was restricted. Potential residents needed to meet certain criteria, especially in terms of dignity, piety, and humbleness. Frank Rexroth has once described them as institutions at the boundary of respectability. Simplified, they took in those who qualified as the really deserving poor in contrast to mere beggars, and saved respectable citizens from losing their respectability, for example, in old age. Thereby, they defined the boundary of respectability. Interestingly, the London House of Converts was also set at a boundary. The boundary between Judaism and Christianity, and in a certain way, it marked that boundary by providing a place for the transition into the Christian faith. It provided for a selected group of people who, in medieval Christian thought, deserved special attention and help. And, as I mentioned earlier, it does seem to have provided a more private arrangement and a lifelong home. Therefore, it is necessary to think of the London House not only as a hospital, but also to consider it a step in the development of almshouses. Jewish converts were here at the forefront of a much larger development. In contrast to the usual residents of almshouses or hospitals for that matter, the London House served specifically converts from Judaism to Christianity, and this particular group of people was tied to a number of specific problems and challenges, which became more and more important at the end of the 12th and in the course of the 13th century. From a Christian or governmental point of view, the three main problems, which were indeed interdependent at several points, were poverty, ambiguity, and backsliding, in combination with a certain lack of knowledge about the Christian faith. As several scholars have shown, religious conversion in the Middle Ages was not necessarily motivated by spiritual aims. It could also serve very profane reasons. I cannot go into detail today, but as far as I can say, economic and social reasons could have been as important as religious ones, sometimes even more. Among them, poverty was a strong incentive to change faith. This could make converts suspect in the eyes of other Christians and could lead to a life merely in between the religious communities. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, for example, complained that the converts to Christianity did not leave their former lives completely and therefore endangered the Christian faith. Others claimed that certain converts constantly changed their religious affiliation based on their momentary needs. Thus, converts were often perceived as being ambiguous. This was particularly problematic in the Middle Ages because religious affiliation was not only of social but of legal importance. It determined one's legal status. Then again, Jews who converted to Christianity quite reliably lost their property if they had any. In England, for example, the king claimed everything a converted Jew possessed as his own property. So one way or another, many converts were poor. And this economic situation raised a problem for the Christian authorities. They feared that converts who could not sustain themselves would go back to Judaism. Therefore, it is not a coincidence that most of the times when a pope of the 12th or 13th century ordered a monastery or a bishop to provide for a Jewish convert, we have several records of this, he argued that the former Jew must be supported in order to prevent him from backsliding. Converts who left the Christian community to join their former religionists, again, were perceived as a threat to the Church, whose universal truth and sacrament of baptism they challenged. Furthermore, we're talking of a time when Christian but also Jewish authorities feared that the religious communities, or rather their members, became less and less distinguishable, where religious ambiguity was not to be tolerated by religious authorities. Particularly, the aforementioned canons of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 show a strong need to strengthen the boundary between Christianity and Judaism. In brief, converts trod on very sensitive ground. The London House of Converts did address these challenges very well. I cannot say for sure what was intended and what was a mere side effect of other decisions, but the whole composition of the London House fitted the needs of the time. The converts were provided for so that they usually did not have to suffer a lack of sustenance. Therefore, they were prevented from the need to seek help in the Jewish community and could possibly be watched and controlled by the Christian administration. Furthermore, they had to leave their former residence and were separated from the Jewish communities. Frequent contacts, which seemed to have happened between converts and their former co-religionists quite often, were reduced or even stopped. As residents of a Christian house living under a Christian rule, there was no room for ambiguity, at least on the outside. What we cannot determine is in how far the fact that the house was nearly entirely inhabited by former Jews, thus by people from a similar cultural background, may have led to the formation of a kind of in-between identity as has been proposed by different scholars. What we can tell is that the fact that the new Christians lived in a Christian home and were instructed in the Christian faith certainly helped against the problem that many converts in the 13th century did not receive a proper education in the Christian faith before baptism. Whenever possible, there should even have been a chaplain in the house who was a convert himself. It is quite probable that this should have helped the residents on their spiritual journey. Presumably, many people stayed in the house for a very long period of time and did not or could not choose a life fully inside the Christian society of England. At the latest, King Edward I tried to change this in 1280, 50 years after the foundation of the house, by ordering that every suitable convert should either get vocational training or be prepared for a career in the church. They should be supported by the house as long as needed, but lose their stipends as soon as they could sustain themselves. This way, the house should help the converts to become independent members of the Christian community instead of dependent and unreliable poor. Furthermore, the chaplains and the warden of the London House were asked twice to check the eligibility of a convert or even his conversion itself. In these instances, their function was to disambiguate the status of a former Jew. This was even excelled by another incident. In the 1280s, when Bishop John Packham wanted several alleged apostates to be investigated, It was the warden of the House of Converts who was seen responsible to take action. The house obviously was a center of competence in matters of conversion and helped to strengthen the boundary between Judaism and Christianity by trying to exercise at least a certain amount of control. All of this belongs in a much broader context, which I can only touch on superficially today. Support for converts in 13th century England was not only provided by the House of Converts, but also outside of its premises. Some converts who did not live in the house received money from its warden. Some were directly supported by the crown. Much more important was the habit of the English kings, especially Henry III, to send converts into religious houses to receive provision there. The most famous incident happened in 1255 when about 150 people were treated at a time. But this was only the most visible example. In fact, there are several hints that this distribution of converts happened quite constantly in the 13th century. Converts in England, thus, seem to have had good chances to find provision if needed, either inside or outside a London house. This should of course not imply any kind of modern welfare system, but it seems very remarkable for the 13th century. The Domus Conversorum played an important role for the support of converts in medieval England, for it was something like its institutionalized version. This does not mean that there were not a lot of converts, probably even a majority, who never set foot into the London house. So how can we sum up these brief thoughts and assumptions? In my opinion, an underestimated focus of the house was to deal with a challenge and to prevent new problems in the future. It was as much meant to guard the boundary between Judaism and Christianity as to give relief to a certain group of poor people. Although the prospect of being provided for might have stimulated some conversions, it does not appear to have been the house's most important aim. Its focus lay on dealing with the converts and their futures within the Christian community. Its communication was directed to Christians, not to Jews. Furthermore, it seems to have anticipated certain developments in poor relief. From this perspective, the converts seem much more similar to the latest so-called deserving poor of a certain community patron or almshouse than to the average undistinguished poor. They seem to have been something like the personal deserving poor of the king, who had very good chances of being provided for when they pleaded to the crown. It is striking that it was the king who felt responsible for the converts and organized the provision within and without the house. He did so in cooperation with monasteries and other religious houses, but it was clearly him who was in charge. In my point of view, this is mainly a consequence of the special position of the Jews of England. Jewish policies were the policies of the crown. Conversion policies seemed to have continued this. It was not a coincidence that there were two parallel terms in use: the king's Jews, Judäi-Regis, and the king's converts, Conversi-Regis. Thank you.
Fourth and final speaker is Sarah Mandel, who's a PhD student at the History Department at Tel Aviv University. She's about to submit her thesis, which is titled Judges, Jews, and Judgments at the 18th Century English Bar. Her master's was in the study of Jewish-Christian relations at Cambridge, and her BA was in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University. Her research interests lie in the interaction of law and religion, identity, and the construction of others or minorities. And she will speak to us on If Jews Are Made English, the English Are Jews, Jewish conversions in English law from the 18th to the 21st century.
A little story before I begin. The late Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who was the head of the yeshiva in Allenschwert, one day went to give a class to his students who at that time were conscripted into the army. So he arrives at the army base, he goes into a classroom, sits down with a bunch of guys and starts teaching them, and slowly, each of them fall asleep. And he keeps talking, and he keeps talking. And at the end of the hour, I think the commanding officer comes in and says, "Why are you talking to a bunch of sleeping people?" And he says, "Well, they obviously really need to sleep, and if I'd have stopped speaking, they would have woken up." So I kept going. So I hope either I'll be great background noise to the much needed nap that you need, or I'll share some ideas with you about Jewish conversions in English law from the 18th to the 21st century. Comparing judicial attitudes to conversion from the 18th to the 21st century sheds light on the intensely religious nature of these interactions. It highlights the courtroom as a forum for the interfaith encounter, even in the ostensibly secular context of the more modern period, and reflects the endurance of important themes around Jewish identity and conversion across very different social and cultural historical periods. Examining conversion through the prism of law showcases the legal process as an opportunity for identity assertion and performance by all parties, while the need to come to a decision clarifies the jurist's attitudes and priorities. With all the caveats about the difficulties in defining and distinguishing two discrete religions, and the problems in generalizing about Jewish or Christian approaches, this paper will explore how jurists, self-identifying as Christian defenders of a constitution that enshrined the unity of church and state, dealt with cases involving Jewish conversion in the 18th century. This period saw the earliest engagement of the English legal system with the growing Jewish community after its readmission in the mid-17th century. In the context of minimal parliamentary provision, it was left to the courts to negotiate the legal status of this anomalous national religious group, which had only a figurative presence in English law since their expulsion in 1290. It will then consider how tropes, attitudes, and even legal paradigms from the 18th century appear in the very different legal context of the 21st. The legal approaches to conversion in 2009 display versions of the judicial uncertainties and anxieties about the source or nature of Jewish identity and conversion from the much earlier period of English history. Miss Jones was born to Jewish parents on May 25, 1779. She married Mr. Robinson in 1797 at the age of 17. They were married in a church by license without the knowledge or consent of Miss Jones's father. Their 16-year marriage produced children, but for a reason we do not know, Miss Jones sought to end the marriage, and the case reached the Consistory Court of London in May 1815. The basic claim was that, according to the 1753 Marriage Act, a minor needed parental permission to marry by license, and seeing as this was lacking, her marriage was invalid from the start, and hence eligible for annulment. Thus far, pretty simple. The complicating factor was Jones's Jewish parentage. Jews and Quakers were exempted from the terms of the 1753 Act in order that they could continue to marry in their particular religious ceremonies. So the judge was faced with the dilemma of whether to treat Jones as a Jew or as a Christian. If she was a Jew, then the lack of parental consent, a provision of the Marriage Act, was not critical to the validity of the marriage. The judge noted the complexity of the case. She certainly, quote, appears to be a Jewess, he said. At least she is descended of Jewish parents. That she continues so is not proved, end quote. Jones was born Jewish but married in a Christian ceremony. Her behaviour was not consistent with her supposed religious designation. There's no discussion in this case report as to whether Jones's behaviour constituted deliberate or de facto conversion. The only question considered was whether the general law of marriage applied in this case. Did Jones's ethnicity as a Jew or her religious performance as a Christian define which law she was subject to? Judge William Scott ultimately annulled the marriage on the basis that Jones's participation in a Christian marriage service made her subject to the terms of such a ceremony. Another case similarly evoked this dilemma of judicial conceptions of Jewish identity and conversion, with practice, ethnicity and belief confused and overlapping. John King, a money broker, was called to the stand as a witness before Lord Kenyon at the Court of the King's Bench on Friday, February 20th, 1795. He took his oath on the New Testament, but was later challenged as to whether he was in fact a Christian. He answered that though he was born a Jew, he'd been a Protestant since he had had the capacity to decide for himself, though he had never renounced his Jewishness. He further revealed that he had married his first wife according to Jewish rites, and that he had never been baptized nor formally joined the established church. On this basis, the barrister argued that he could not possibly, quote, consider an oath so taken as obligatory, quote. Yet Lord Kenyon accepted his testimony, relying on his personal faith declaration as sufficient basis that he felt bound by the oath. In both cases, ethnicity and practice conflicted. The judge's comments reflect a belief that a person is born Jewish by virtue of their parentage, but they can choose to convert.
and that this conversion manifests in their actions or practice. In the second case of John King, even the element of practice was not determinative, yet the judge tended towards assuming a Jewish to Christian conversion expressed in actions. In these cases, the actions were Miss Jones's participation in the Christian marriage ceremony and John King's oath on the New Testament. What the terse and dry court reports of these cases fail to convey is the gravitas and complexity of questions involving Jewish conversion, an issue which penetrated the heart of English and Christian identity in this period. 18th century judges ruled in a social context in which Jews were objects of missionary zeal, and every conversion was a triumph. Yet apprehensions about the fundamentals of Jewish identity, historical tropes of the subversive Jew, and concrete evidence of reverted conversions made real Jewish conversions uncomfortable ground. The Jews' unfettered lives in England were a proud sign of the dignity and toleration of English society. Yet in a period of uncertain political and religious horizons, with religious dissent multiplying and fluid international loyalties, conversion of the other, whether Jew, infidel, heretic, or anyone else, was, quote, the surest sign of conversion of the self, end quote. The continued existence of Jews was theologically and socially challenging, yet reassuring. Conversions were desirable, but simultaneously suspect and unsettling. Hence, external threats were characterized as attempts to Judaize the English, an imagined metaphor which nonetheless reflected attitudes to real Jews and conversion in England. Jewish conversion in the English courtroom encapsulated many of the challenges to English national identity at that time. Loyalty to the monarch in the post-Glorious Revolution era, and loyalty to the church and the establishment at a time of growing religious dissent and ongoing wars with Catholic France. The judge's deliberations in relation to converted individuals often reflect these fundamental themes and fissures, even when not explicitly engaged with. In the 1717 trial of Francis Francia, the defendant is clearly identified as a Jew in the court and in the court record. The Attorney General is careful to highlight that, quote, the defendant lives in Plough Yard in Fetter Lane and goes for a Jew, end quote. And indeed, this case is frequently cited in the historiographical narrative about Jews being allowed to swear a court oath on the Old Testament. However, what is not usually mentioned is that the witness who swore the oath then gave evidence that Francia, quote, was born in Bordeaux and immediately baptized, end quote. This means that the proclaimed Jew, whose evidence would be heard on his oath as a Jew, had passed through a foundational Christian ceremony at his birth. Evidence like this would only feed the widespread Christian anxiety over the depth of Jewish deception, which could persist beyond conversion, and the perceived need for distance and distinction between the communities to control border crossing. If a baptized Jew is still a Jew, this adds a layer of complication to any assessment of conversion in the court. On the one hand, the judge is bound to defend the faith of England, which necessarily entails a desire for the conversion of the Jews. But simultaneously, he's conditioned to suspect any convert of insincerity and possible reversal. Judicial reasoning around conversion centered upon convenience or public policy, logic and the defense of natural rights. While seeking to avoid any potential threat to the Anglican Church, judges made numerous explicit declarations of their desire to be religion blind or not wanting to be drawn into disputes of private religious nature. However, their interventions concerning conversion did, perhaps unavoidably given their cultural and historical context, reflect their religious suppositions as Christians. This can be clearly seen in a 1737 custody case concerning the children of Kitty Villarreal, who she had borne to her Jewish husband, who had then passed away. Kitty had entrusted the children to her father as the official guardian. She then converted and was baptized and married Anglican William Mellish. In 1737, together with her children, she petitioned the court to be reunited with the children, which would de facto result in them being raised as Anglicans, not Jews. Deep religious, ethical and public policy questions centered around the deceased Jewish father's supposed preferences, the mother's natural rights to her children, and the state's role in promoting the established church. The Attorney General succinctly highlighted the dilemma. Quote, the real question is whether the court will interpose to give such a guardian to Jewish children as may change their religion, end quote. The Lord Chancellor rooted the mother's right to her children in nature, but noting that the deceased father was Jewish, and not wanting to directly intervene in a religious matter, nor the natural rights of the father, the Attorney General emphasised, quote, "It was thought one of the hardest parts of the persecution of Protestants abroad, the taking away of the children and putting them under a different education," end quote. Ultimately, the mother's petition was rejected, but the children's one was not, resulting in their removal to their now Christian mother and stepfather. In this case, the judge pinned his decision on the natural rights of the children to their mother, while conveniently the decision resulted in the children being raised as Christians. Chief Justice Hardwicke performed his Christian duty, protected the boundaries between the faiths, and justified it all in terms of natural rights rather than religious expansionism. In the 21st century, Christian-Jewish conversion again took centre stage in the English courtroom, evoking versions of the judicial uncertainties and anxieties about the source or nature of Jewish identity and conversion from the much earlier period of English history. In December 2009, the British Supreme Court was asked to intervene in a Jewish school's admissions policy. The school wished to accept only those students who were Jewish according to the definition of the Office of the Chief Rabbi, a normative Orthodox definition based on matrilineal descent. While a father wanted the school to accept his child, M, who was born to a woman who had converted under the auspices of the UK Masorti movement. The school did not recognise the validity of the conversion, hence did not consider the boy Jewish and therefore rejected the application. The father claimed that the school violated the terms of the Race Relations Act in treating his child differently because of his ethnicity, because he was not born to a Jewish woman. The judges, who were divided in their opinions as to how and whether the law should intervene, published comments which revealed that their legal stance was inseparable from their theological, religious and socio-political perspectives. Their majority decision of 5-4 that the school's admissions policy did contravene the 1976 Race Relations Act, and the consequent imposition of a religious practice test as the criteria of admission to any UK Jewish school, has had serious repercussions for British Jewish ritual observance and communal life. One of the minority justices, Lord Brown, stated that the decision, quote, "insists on a non-Jewish definition of who is Jewish," end quote. The court decision is a 108-page, intensely religious document, in which the 9 justices each explain the reasoning behind their decision. It begins with a quote from the 7th chapter of Deuteronomy, and each judge proceeds to use his religious knowledge and assumptions to reason whether the school contravened the Race Relations Act, i.e. whether it discriminated against the child on the basis of race in refusing his admission. Some of the judges are practicing Christians, others not so, at least one is Catholic and one has some Jewish heritage. I do not claim that these justices are as self-consciously Christian as those of the 18th century. But it is clear that the religious paradigm that they applied to this case of Jewish conversion reflects many of the suppositions and conceptual assumptions about religion that apply in the earlier period. Just as in the 18th century, some judges expressed a preference not to intervene in such a deeply religious disagreement, what some recognised as actually an internal debate between different strands of Judaism about what constitutes an acceptable conversion. However, others noted that all strands of Judaism actually support religious identity dependent on descent, and hence a similar case could have been brought against a liberal Jewish school that would recognise patrilineal descent. Indeed, the way the decision was delivered, it made no difference that M was considered Jewish by Masorti Jews. He could have been from a family of any faith or none. The problem was that one of his parents was not Jewish, and that he was refused entry based on an attribute or status of that parent. Hence, the judges were grappling with the very same core issues as in the 18th century, the national or ethnic element of a Jewish identity. The comparison was made with Christian faith schools that require baptism as a criteria of acceptance. However, this comparison was rejected by Lord Mance, who conceptualised baptism as an expression of individual choice, and therefore a reasonable ground for a school to differentiate between populations. Mance insisted that, quote, "neither parental birth nor the fact that a mother has not converted to Orthodox Judaism at a time prior to a child's birth can be regarded as within the conception of parental responsibility and choice," end quote. While it was mentioned that baptism would most probably depend on the parents being Christians in order that they would take the decision to baptise the child, for Lord Mance, this would not violate the need to treat every person, quote, "according to their individual attributes," end quote, rather than as descendants of a particular tradition. The projection of a Christian conception of religion as faith is evident throughout the judgment. For example, when Mance noted that Judaism is not a proselytizing religion, and hence, quote, those who are not Jews can still earn salvation, end quote, importing a thoroughly Christian conception of the purpose of religious life. Also, when Lord Philip stated that religion normally requires some degree of conscious affiliation on the part of the member. In contrast, though Lord Hope noted that the dispute over the boy's identity was clearly a religious one, as had he or his mother converted under Orthodox auspices, his mother's Italianness or Catholic background would have been irrelevant. The majority of the justices struggle with the national or ethnic element of Jewish identity. Numerous judges repeatedly situate M's mother's Italian birth as characterizing or reflecting her non-Jewishness. In the attempt to understand the ethnic element of Jewish identity, they placed it on a par with national identity, which itself raises its own problems in terms of the identity and imputed loyalties of British Jews. Ultimately, though even some of the majority lords recognized that the chief rabbi was only interested in M's ethnicity for religious reasons, the law does not allow for an excuse of justification when it comes to direct discrimination. Hence they ruled that the school had discriminated against M on ethnic grounds. Despite Lord Hope's appeal that, quote, something has gone wrong, end quote, the result was that Jewish kids, or ironically their parents, now need to demonstrate that they practice Judaism. They get points for going to synagogue, observing festivals and keeping kosher, which make them eligible to be accepted into JFS. This case was exceptional in the explicitly religious approach taken by many of the lords and the clear misunderstandings and fault lines in their conception of Jewish identity. Despite a clear and explicitly stated wish to respect Jewish tradition, however each judge conceived of it, they were unable to allow for a religious identity that was not dependent solely on individual faith. What is described as natural in the 18th century is framed as, quote, compatible with human dignity, end quote, in the 21st. However, across both eras, the judges are implicitly conforming and defending their national and religious identity by reinforcing conceptions of religion as universal and founded in personal choice. This comparative analysis highlights the challenges members of one religious group face in understanding the conversion of another and the manifestation of this encounter in the legal sphere. Modern judges may employ secular legal tools, but they are culturally and socially embedded individuals with their own theologies and religious preconceptions. In the 18th century, judges phrased their reasoning in terms of non-positivist natural law. In the 21st, they refer to European legislation and the Race Relations Act. Yet in both periods, they grapple with the national element of Jewish religious identity and the implications this has for understanding conversion in the courtroom. In both eras, judicial rulings are more a reflection of the performance of identity taking place in the courtroom than they are a sensitive understanding of Jewish identity or conversion. Thank you.
I want to thank all four speakers for very interesting papers. And we now have about half an hour for questions and comments.
Yeah, I have a question for Franziska. Thank you very much. What you explained about the Domus Conversorum reminded me of the Collegium Neophiti in Rome. Of course, different place, different context, 16th century. But the story of this house at Rome was actually that the Holy See wanted to give a training to converts in order to become teachers for Hebrew, Arabic, or even to transmit, to convey an inside knowledge to future missionaries. Okay, so is there any indication that a similar purpose was the case in this Domus Conversorum in London?
Maybe we can leave it in to answer. Yeah, definitely. As far as I can tell, not really. So it was wanted by the English crown that converts could become priests, and they paid money for it, yes. But there weren't any missionary efforts by the English kings. There's one incident where Edward I told his officials to protect the friars preaching to the Jews, but this was not royal policy. It was the friars who asked him for his help, and then he said, okay. But neither inside the domus nor outside has been any missionary efforts, so I don't think so. I think this helping converts becoming priests was more of an act of stabilizing, and perhaps have some in the domus itself to have there, but they haven't been applied to missionaries.
These friars, were they Dominicans or Franciscans?
The preaching, I think it were Dominicans.
Thank you for this session. I want to comment or to add some matter, because I think both Sarah and Camilla deals with ambiguity of identification of who is a Jew, who is a Muslim. So there are quite nice examples in the Karageniza for such ambiguity, and I want to tell a little to bring such a nice example of a person who came from Ashkelon to Cairo. He had a wife and a daughter, and he was called to court in order to check the status of his daughter who reached puberty. So they wanted to know if she's can marry a Jew or not. And he admitted that when he was in Ashkelon, he bought a slave girl and with her daughter. It was quite common to buy two for the price of one, you know. But he said that the daughter passed away, and after she passed away, he released his slave girl. While releasing her, she automatically became a Jew, and he married her, and she bore him this girl, and the court didn't believe him, and forced him to bring witnesses, and he found witnesses in Ashkelon that approved this story. I think Moshe, if he's there, can elaborate on this if I left some data. Oh, it's okay, okay. That's it, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Amir, for this information, and I'd like to take the reference later on, if you have it. My text is rather theoretical, I think. There may have been cases like that, and that's why it would be interesting to read this text, which, many of the Geniza documents, of course, do reflect what was actually going on. I think that's the difference between my text and the ones, the cases that you were discussing.
Hi, I would like to thank you also, all four of you, for really fascinating papers. I have a number of questions, so can I start with Camilla? I think in the you said something along the way about in the question of inheritance, that if one of them got married, and I can't remember exactly how it all tied up, but when one of them got married, how could they have got married, under which law could they have got married in order for them to have been able to decide about inheritance, one? Two, what would have happened, or is there any idea what would have happened if both of them had decided to embrace Judaism? In other words, how would that have worked out? And something that we were thinking about, or that Rami said, is what I don't know if you want to say it yourself, is wouldn't one of the children have been circumcised?
Oh yeah,
one of them, not the.
I did mention that, but I think I mentioned it in the abstract. Oh no, I can't remember now. Yeah, definitely. I mean,
that would be, of course, a dead giveaway.
So it's clear in this case, so that it wouldn't be a dead giveaway that neither of the children were circumcised.
No, it's not a real case.
No, I mean, neither of the children could have been circumcised for them to, otherwise the whole thing would have...
Right, it just reinforces the fact that it's fiction, because if in a real case, the Jewish kid would have, presumably, if he was older than 8 days, which presumably was.
Yes, I think that...
So that's the first part.
Yes, so they didn't do this.
I think that, and also what you mentioned about marriage, I mean, that also got me thinking that something isn't working out here. So that obviously shows that we didn't have much of a clue, I think, with regard to Jewish law. So I have always thought from the beginning when I first saw this text that this can't reflect a real case. And the istifta, the description of the case already looks very theoretical, and the way he goes about explaining, providing an answer to the query reinforces that impression, I think. Also the analogies that he draws they're great to read, but they're very funny. So I really do think that this is more of an exercise in legal reasoning. There are a couple of points that he hasn't covered fully.
So that brings me to my second point, which was, how many of the other 350 fatwas do you think are, I mean, is this unusual fatwa in the sense that it's more theoretical, or are others of the fatwas also sort of more...
I think most of the ones in this collection by Nawawi are theoretical. There are very few which made me think, oh, this might actually reflect actual practice. It was a very different experience reading this from reading, for example, the Andalusi or North African fatwas that you find in Ibn Rushd or al-Sharisi. I mean, there you really get the idea that these are real cases, these are real problems that people come to the Mufti with and which they want solved. Whereas here, in most cases, well, also the very short text that I presented. I mean, some of them may reflect true questions that the believers had: can I eat this or that and the other, or is there any merit to eating this, that and the other because the Prophet did it? Yeah. But most of these queries, they give the impression of being purely theoretical, as opposed to the North African ones. Thanks.
Inbar, can I ask you? I found your talk. Can you hear me? Okay. I found your talk really fascinating on a number of levels, and the idea of monastic, the idea that someone who is a layman and then becomes a monk is an act of conversion, is in itself interesting, and sometimes it actually works out in the use of the language, because of course, I mean, here it's Greek, but in the Latin, of course, conversions, in fact, it means a change of heart, right? More than not necessarily a religious conversion, but what's in the use of cognitive science is also something which I find fascinating. But how can you take this methodology? This methodology works, I think, in this case because you're talking about someone who converts into a system. Okay, but can we use this this methodology in other circumstances where the person is converting from one religion to another, but they're not converting into a particular type of framework, or like, so here right, you're going to become a monk, so there are certain things that you do to become, right, there are certain things that you do to train your mind to become a monk. But people convert for all sorts of religious conversions now, right? People convert for all sorts of reasons. Could cognitive science still be useful in that context as well?
Yeah, well, I think the word systematic is the key to this answer. Everything that will be done really extensively and systematically, I think, can be somehow be concretized, be concrete enough to see it in the cognitive framework. So the problem is that when you don't have a system and you start to do it, for example, just on a personal choice basis, it does not get systematic. I mean, I know it, I tried myself to meditate just on my own, to invent my own procedures to meditate, and it doesn't work. I mean, you have to have a system, and you have to even have a master that enforces these techniques on you. Otherwise, it's not working. It has to be really systematic and coherent.
So it would be difficult to take this methodology and apply it to conversion in a broader sense?
I think it can, if you, in certain contexts, if you can find a context where you can really have sources that describe practices, and they don't have to be meditative, I think. I'm often thinking, this angle is new for me, so I don't know, but I think that physical behavioral practices such as prayer and even weeping, I mean, which is the repentance in monasticism involves, for example, the acts of weeping. I mean, we have to sit with cognitive scientists really and to see how this can be done, but I think it has a cognitive basis, so it can be.
I have other questions, but I have other people.
No, there's two questions in the back.
And there's questions over there too.
Yeah, okay, so go ahead, please.
So, thank you. I have two questions. The first one is for Franziska. The second one is for Inbar again, then I will pass the microphone to him. So the first question pertains to the if you could tell us something about the literature that's been used possibly to convert these Jews to Christianity. Since I'm dealing with the 13th century literature, namely on the Latin Talmud, so the translation of the Talmud, just to show how nice it was and possibly to be used in some kind of religious context, just to show what someone should actually convert to Christianity. I wonder if you could tell us some information about the possible use, also in time, has changed of polemical literature in this context. And the second question is for Inbar. I found fascinating your conference, especially about the neurological sciences, which about I know nothing. So I was just wondering if you are familiar with Giorgio Agamben's Highest Poverty, which is which I read actually in Italian, where he argues that the development of Franciscan monasteries in the West played a major role in developing the notion of time and self-awareness of time among the monks, and then by extension to the Western society.
Sorry, developing what?
The notion of time, the impression of time. So by saying that since you internalize liturgy, so you automatize, so you don't have clocks, but you actually you can expose to the certain rhythm of time, so you internalize this, and then you use an internal clock to say, well, it's time that I do this and that. So I'm wondering if, since you argued that there are some important discrepancies between the Western and Eastern monastic movements, if you could argue with this notion of so in a philosophical context. Again, neurosciences know nothing, unless that's my girlfriend would like to deprogram me, is the only thing that I know about automatism.
Yes, also a question, observation regarding the presentation of Inbar, which I listened to with great interest. Maybe the question of Chaim, if maybe this neurological approach can help to understand conversion process and spirituality in general, can also maybe be applied for the catechetical practice in all the Christianity, with the catechesis before baptism, and also then the which were intended to be as an approach to certain way of Christian practices, the Eucharist, And so where you also have a combination between the analytical aspect of education, but also then the corporeal practices of Christian education. And I think with the presentation you touched a big, important aspect of early Christian studies, which can still be deepened in early Christian studies, the concept of emotional control. How Christian preachers, I think of Chrysostom, they perceive themselves as preachers insofar as they also wanted to control what kind of emotions are appropriate and are not in certain circumstances. I think the right at the stages, how and so on and so on. Yes, I don't want to deepen this too much, but it's really, it can touch beyond monasticism, also the whole aspect of Christianization of the Roman Empire.
Perhaps I just begin because it's a very short answer. I'm afraid I cannot really tell you anything about it. I focus on the converts on a very practical level and royal context. And since there was no royal mission to the Jews of England, I cannot tell you anything about it. There were some efforts by the friars. I don't think what they used differed much from the continent, but I can't give you any specific things.
Matthew Periston.
Matthew Periston. There's a lot of them.
Yeah. So I'll start with the last question. Emotion control is indeed very relevant to this, in general, to monasticism and to organized form of life in general. Thank you. But I don't think we need the whole notion of neuroplasticity for this. I mean, I wrote about the practices of emotion control in monasticism long before I even got to know about brain neuroplasticity. So even the ways of talking. I mean, monks did not say I think. They said the thought tells me. I think this habit of talking influenced their emotion and it was a practice of emotion management. It helped them to get away from, to distance themselves from themselves. So yes, it is very relevant, but neuroplasticity takes it one step further. And regarding the time in Franciscan use, yes, I mean, surely it's more than that. I mean, everything that you do repeatedly is internalized and creates you as you are. And so habits may begin accidentally or not, but they become you. I don't know how this can be quantified or be concrete enough to work with it. Perhaps it is possible, but I don't know. I can think of how I can now sit and work with practices of interiorizing notions of time and how this promotes conversion or can be related to it. So.
Just 1 second, there was a question here, and then you and Nadia and Moshe. Maybe we'll take all the questions because we don't have that much time, and then we can...
Okay, I have a couple of questions for Inbar, but I'll just mention one, and a question for Sarah. You talk about using cognitive psychology to help understand. I can understand. But the way you talk and the way the things that you said, the sentences, with all due respect, I simply don't understand. You talk about purifying the mind. I understand what is to purify water, but how do you purify the mind? You talk about to attend to God, to attend to... who is he? I mean, what is it to attend? Anything can go. I mean, it's not so clear. And that is, you're talking metaphoric all the way down, and I don't know if that means anything in the end. That's my question. And my question to you, Sarah, is what do you expect of English judges? Why should they take account of the national, your view of national view of Judaism? They're not judges in Israel. They are judges in England. And I mean, we may think of it like this, but they are not, you know, not obligated to.
Do you want to reply?
Thank you. I'm Nadia Zeldes from the Center, for those who don't know me. And I have one short question for Camilla and a longer one for Francesca. Camilla, I know you were discussing theoretical questions, and yet I would like to ask you if in the 12th century, I think it was, Al-Nawawi was in the 12th century, right? 13, even more, even later. What I'm curious about is if there were any actual cases of Muslims marrying non-Muslim women in this period. I know that at the beginning of Islam it was rather common, but the question is if it could have at all referred to a concrete case, or was it really purely theoretical, just, that's your question. The other is more like a comment. I have not studied the history of the Jews in England, but I use the Domus Conversorum as an example for the change of policy that happened in 13th century Europe as opposed to previous periods. I mean, after Lateran III, there was a decision, I mean, the church encouraged conversions and was of the opinion that converts should be rewarded instead of, for instance, sanctioned by confiscating their property. Now, there was a certain time until lay rulers accepted this view and started to reward the converts. So it happened more or less in the same time during the 13th century. It happened in France with Saint Louis. It also happened, at least there is a story about it, that King Roger II of Sicily rewarded Muslims and Jews who converted. Now, there is a bit of a problem with the dating of this information, but it probably dates at the least, I mean, in the latest, at the beginning of the 13th century. So this idea of doing something to reward Jewish converts to Christianity began to take root in the 13th century. And maybe this Domus Conversorum was part of a larger movement, although I accepted that it is a very interesting way of seeing it as an almshouse. It is a very interesting view, but the question is if it's not a part of a larger movement in response to a certain policy of the church. So that's it.
Okay, we have two more questions. Please make them brief.
Very brief question to Inbar. Thank you very much for putting forward this agenda. Can you present maybe very shortly, very exact case when application of the methodology you described to exact source produced some feasible result? Mm-hmm.
Final question.
Thank you very much. And Camilla, question for you. So if it's a legal discussion, I was wondering, you didn't mention it, but maybe it's also not in the text. Does Nawawi refers at all to milk kinship? And if not, why not? Because this could be a solution, and maybe because it's a theoretical discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much for both questions. Nadia, was there intermarriage between Muslims and Jews taking place in the 12th, 13th century? I think so. I think if you read historical chronicles or also Geniza texts, I'm sure that you'll find references to that. Now, if we just look at my text, the persons we've got here, they are a Muslim man, his wife dies. We don't know anything about the wife. Was she Jewish? She might have been, but we don't know. Yeah, the wife, she's just presented as having died, but otherwise she plays no role. There's a Jewish woman, her husband is absent. We learn nothing about him, yeah? We don't know whether he was Jewish as well or not. Anyway, and I really think that, especially the text that Moshe is dealing with, yeah, might point you in the direction of intermarriage. Now, about Moshe's question about milk kinship, I was going to mention that actually in my reply to Nadia, because it is strange that Nawawi doesn't mention it. I mean, this is one of the reasons that makes me think not just that it is theoretical, but also that although he says, I'm writing for a general public and I do it in very simple terms, this particular question, I think, could only be understood by someone with some legal training. And someone like that would immediately have thought, oh, right, there's a problem here, because if there is this milk relationship, they're actually much closer than we might otherwise be inclined to think. So yeah, this has to be taken into account as well. Thank you.
Purifying the mind and attending to God. I think your question exactly demonstrates one of the reasons why cognitive research is helpful, because these are the metaphors the monks use. I mean, it's not my metaphors. And for a secular modern person, an understanding of how attention works, what it means cognitively to purify the mind, can help. I mean, the fact that these metaphors are ununderstandable for us, I think once I got into these cognitive explanations, helped me to understand what the monks meant. And the concrete example, I'll have to do it later. It will take now more than 2 minutes. Okay. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Well, yes, there were official policies that converts should be better off than before. But at the same time, the converts were perceived as quite a challenge to Christian society. And when you read papal letters which want to persuade monasteries to take in converts, they do not argue specifically with they should have a reward, they should be happy, but they say do it so that they do not go back to Judaism. That's the main argument. So the main argument is not reward, but precaution. It's always the same. And in England especially, it's never called something like reward, or it's in 1280 when it's harvest sentence, when Edward I says that the domus could help to increase the Christian faith. But at the same time, the English kings took away everything from a convert and gave them kind of a pity to live on. So I don't think that these church policies, which are clearly there, were really put into action. I think we have to make a difference here. Same thing in France. They stopped confiscating converts' goods for some time, but in most of the countries, Europe, as far as I know, they did not.
Also in Aragon, they stopped.
Yeah, but it was a fight, so it was not always the same. So I think there are different lines of work there, and for England, I can't see any encouragement of conversion besides this little money the converts get.
The question, why would I expect anything more from the English judges? Because they expect more of themselves. We have numerous sources where they talk about wanting to be religion blind or wanting to give the Jews as much space of toleration as possible in the 18th century, not wanting to compel them in any way towards Christianity because it had to come from their own free will. More than that, I gave the example of the 1753 Marriage Act, which allowed Jews to marry according to Jewish law. And we have cases of disputes about whether or not a Jewish marriage has taken place, and they bring it to the English judge, and the English judge rolls up his sleeves and gets into Jewish sources and says, okay, I need to work out, did a Jewish marriage take place here? And I'm going to do it on Jewish terms. So there is, even in the 18th century, a clearly expressed desire to deal with certain things to do with Jews from an internal Jewish perspective. And certainly in the 21st century, wanting to provide religious freedom means to a certain extent accepting the definitions and the frameworks of the minority group that you're dealing with. Personally, for me, it's more about the English than it is about the Jews. The Jews are just an occasion in which to look at English identity that's being expressed in the courtroom. And I think that we learn much more about the English in these cases than we do about the Jews. So for me that's the most fascinating, particularly because on a deeper level it's all about creating others so that we understand who we are and working out who we are. And that's what I think I'm finding in these cases. The Jews are just the hook to hang this on.
Okay, please join me in thanking the panel.